and welcome to Diverse and Inclusive Leaders, the show where I interview the most inspirational and thought-provoking leaders of today and unearth their unique stories of diversity and inclusion to help inspire, educate and motivate others to make the world a better place. Today, I am delighted to be joined by the fantastic Andy Goss. Now, Andy is the chairman of the board at Vertu Motors PLC. He's had an extensive career as a board director within the UK and international joint ventures and large multinational automotive organisations. He's an internationally recognised leader within the automotive sector and has experience broadly across the board within retail, distribution and manufacturing. Former experience included working for the likes of Jaguar, Land Rover and Spark 44. He's also done pieces of voluntary work which are very interesting, such as being a school governor at a prestigious local prep school for several years, whilst he was based across in the United States. Welcome to the show, Andy.
Thank you very much. Good morning.
Good morning, and it's great to have you here today. Thank you ever so much for joining us. I wonder, just before we get into the nuts and bolts of the conversation today, firstly, how are you feeling given the current circumstances that we are living in? And secondly, for those that, I'm sure many people obviously know you very well in the automotive sector, but for those perhaps who don't know you as well, whether you could give us a little insight into the world of Andy and how you actually came to be where you are today after the many years experience you've had.
Well, you're right. I mean, we're living through extraordinary times at the moment, aren't we? And it's, I don't think I've ever seen my family members as much as now, actually. So I think they're probably heartily sick of the lockdown because of that alone, in reality. And I've certainly never done family pub quizzes before, which now is a stalwart of every Saturday evening with people on Teams or Zoom or whatever. So yeah, it's tough times, but it's interesting times, and hopefully we'll all come out of this personally better, with a better understanding of our true values in life as well. In terms of myself, I joined the auto industry straight from university quite a few decades ago, frankly. I've operated the last 28 years at C-suite level, and I've been fortunate in that particular period of time as well to see a fair bit of the world. I was based in Holland during the early part of my career for a year, which was very interesting. I've worked in the USA, where I've been based there, physically based there for 3 years, lived through things like Hurricane Sandy, which was a hell of an experience, quite frankly, based out of New Jersey, and found myself there only after 3 months in the role on stage with President Obama, which was something that I didn't recognise before I went there. So that was a bit of time. And when people say to you, you can do anything in the USA, it's pretty much true, actually. So I really enjoyed my time in the USA and Canada there. As you mentioned, I've worked at JLR, I've worked at Toyota. I was CEO of Porsche for 12 years, which is a fascinating company, actually. But during my time at JLR, I was also one of the main board members of the joint venture we got for China, CJLR, Cherry Jaguar Land Rover, which meant that I've been to China 31 times. So I've not lived there, but sometimes I feel as though I have, actually. And that was, again, a fascinating place to do business, a lot different than anywhere else I've ever experienced, quite frankly, but really fascinating. And I learned a hell of a lot from that experience as well. And as you say, latterly, I've been chairman of Vertu Motors, which moves you from an operational and executive role, chasing targets every month, to one being chairman there, where effectively you're making sure that there is a strategy that's laid down and that you're then performance managing against that strategy. And it's quite fortunate in that particular company because we have got a star of a CEO, probably one of the best 3 CEOs in UK car retail, I would say. And of course, during this particular crisis that we're dealing with, it's almost moved from non-executive to executive role because, we're talking 2-3 times every single day because of the issues that everybody is facing, be it furloughing, be it employment, be it cash flow, and now getting into that very interesting period about what happens post all this, because consumers' habits will change as a consequence of this, I think, permanently, and you have to be relevant in the future. So I'm fortunate I've worked in a fascinating industry and worked with some fascinating people, actually. So, I'm quite blessed in that regard.
Thank you so much for sharing, Andy. And wow, I can't believe you've been on stage with Barack Obama. That's amazing. And
I thought
it's absolutely incredible. And if you don't mind me saying, obviously you've had a spectacular career, but I wonder whether I can dig a little into your earlier days, because you've been incredibly driven, excuse the pun, obviously within automotive. But what has driven you across these many years? Because he's looking at the background, of course, with my exec search hat on. I can't help myself looking at people's kind of backgrounds, but it's been such a linear path, straight up. Have you always been this driven? Has there been anything from your childhood that's almost, did you picture yourself being at this point in your career in your early days? Or was there anything that kind of gave you that fire in the belly that said, God, I've got to keep going on and achieving?
I think, when I was at university, I was at Manchester University, a place that, I love Manchester, great place, actually. I've not lived there for many a year, but it's a place that's very close to my heart. And I guess in reality, when I was at university there, I didn't really know what I wanted to do. And of course, you didn't have the same information that people have got today to make those choices. And to a large degree, you probably went in an organisation and thought you'd spend decades there. Society was very, very different. Mm. In my particular case, there was one pivotal moment in my life, which was the fact that, I just had my 22nd birthday, just coming out of university, and my father died from cancer. And that fundamentally changed me as a person, because in those days, when you're 22, it's probably the equivalent to being about 17 now, in terms of your experience and your worldliness, and suddenly you have to shake yourself down and life becomes extremely real. So I think that probably changed not my work ethic, but allowed me to actually focus a hell of a lot on what I wanted to do and get on with things, actually. And I know I was not living in Manchester at that particular time, and I recall very specifically, I was given a choice of for the company I worked for, then a car company, going back to Manchester or going to London. And I chose to go to London because I thought, like, you've got to go to the big city, if you like. Don't go back and become over domesticated. You've got to get on. So I think that more than anything in my early career made a huge difference, actually. So every awful black cloud can have a silver lining to a certain degree.
Thanks so much for sharing. Well, I bet your dad will be incredibly proud looking back at what his sons achieve over the years. My goodness.
He'd be quite amazed, actually.
Yeah, absolutely. What did your father do and your mother, if you don't mind me asking?
Well, back in the day then, and people from the north of England may recognise this, but Trafford Park, was the biggest industrial centre in Europe. And my father was an engineer in Trafford Park, a toolmaker there. I've got no skill set in that area whatsoever. I've always worked in commercial operation, but yeah, he worked as an engineer in Trafford Park, which was a hell of a place. Less so now, of course. It's not a big industrial centre in the UK anymore. There's some great companies there, but back in the day, that was the place to be, actually.
How fascinating. So it's a brilliant story as well of kind of huge upward social mobility in terms of, hardworking parents, and you've literally, taken that right up to the top. It's just absolutely fantastic. Absolutely fantastic.
Yeah, it's, I say, very different now. It's a long time ago, of course, now, all those years.
Well, thank you for sharing, Andy. And talking of then, moving on, obviously, latterly into the career and starting to travel across the board. You mentioned you've been to China 31 times and probably felt like you almost lived there to a degree, but also across the board to the States. How about not only the travel, but I suppose the experiences you had culturally with different teams and different ways of doing business? How was that? Because again, it must have been, there's a first for everything in the career where you literally up and went across the pond.
Well, I think I mean, to start with, I recommend to anybody, frankly, go and work outside the country that you're born for a period of time. Go and see the world and actually absorb, understand, and actually go into those places as an immigrant as well, because your perspective will change for the better in a whole number of areas, I would say, and you'll blossom and you'll learn. Not just, education to learn about the role that you're doing, you'll see things that otherwise you just could not have experienced. For me, when I went to the States, as an example, and I visited, I think, probably 32 of the US states now, and we had Canada as well. It was a hell of an experience because, as I mentioned before, that there's a bit of an old cliche that, you can do anything you want in the States if you try hard enough. And of course, that appears a bit trite, but I think it's actually pretty true. And, in the industry, I was president of Jaguar Land Rover North America, so based out of New Jersey, and we had Canada there as well as the US. And it was a bit of a turnaround job when I first went there, actually, because the company was struggling a bit. Tata owned the company from 2008, 2009. I was over in the States from 2011. Never worked for JLR before. I'd been 12 years at Porsche, so I'd been headhunted. Went straight into the country. Family joined me after 3 months, and it was invigorating. And of course, to a large degree, what you're doing is trying to put the voice of the USA, in particular, back into JLR, because companies fail when they try to export Germanism or Britishness or whatever as regards to culture. You've got to understand the market, and you've got to understand how to do business in that market. And as a Brit over there, and 2 ears, 1 mouth, doing a lot of listening, it was great to bring those experiences back into the company. And I think one thing that was extremely enjoyable as well is that, as we know, the media in the States is extremely fragmented, and they want to work with you, actually. So often you'd find yourself in a New York TV station at 5 o'clock on a Friday night because they wanted news stories, and it was a very much more collegiate perspective than maybe some of the more sensationalist UK press. So that was an invigorating experience. And as you say, China, which is a hell of a place, huge place, and of course always very difficult for people that are not Chinese because of the language difference, and that is a huge issue there. And I think probably the States experience helped me no end for China, because you really had to go there and establish credibility, and you had to absorb the market, and you had to learn how to do business in China. And I remember the joint venture heads from the Cherry organization said to me very often, you need to learn how to do business in China. And they were absolutely right. And it was a very, very interesting period there, actually, because after only a couple of months, the company, Jaguar Land Rover, were on television on the consumer program, not with the best story in the world, quite frankly, with a technical problem on a car. My word. As a consequence of that, things became extremely hectic for the next 2 years, actually. But I enjoyed it immensely. I enjoyed going over there. It was tough. You were doing double shifts per day, so really you're doing 7 till 11 every day because of the time difference between the UK and China. But I would hope that I allowed people that are there to flourish and get their voice again back into the UK as their mouthpiece. And I certainly had my eyes opened in terms of what is possible there, and the fact that this is the most important car market in the world, without a shadow of doubt. And if you make it in China, you make it everywhere. And of course, the whole industry probably benefited coming out of 2008, because if you weren't for China, a lot of large car manufacturers would not exist. I strongly suspect there'll be a similar issue coming out of the COVID-19 situation, whereby China's recovered sooner. I think people that can do business over there and understand the market there, the 25, 26 million market, will actually benefit, and probably their whole, global operation can keep afloat because of what happens in China. So bottom line is, I've been very fortunate to work in in those places and others as well. But those for me were two standout locations without a shadow of doubt.
That's absolutely fascinating. And you said a number of points there that really, really resonated. Is, I mean, first of all, to really learn about yourself and to flourish by visiting and taking a dive and going off to another country with a completely different culture, and also many smaller cultures within that across all the states that you've been in America. I'm sure there's lots of smaller cultures within there, but your comparable between the UK and the US is absolutely kind of nail on the head, really, where you say maybe it does sound a little trite that there is a world of opportunity and such like out in the States. I've been over there myself, and it is absolutely so similar yet so incredibly different. Just the language is the same, but the meanings behind things and the absolute forthright nature of the Americans is just absolutely fascinating. And again, very, very different to that of China. And I wonder, because you'll have to, of course, learn, communicate, as you said, have two ears and one mouth. Whatever you do, wherever you go, you must absolutely listen and absorb everything that's going around you because of the specifics of the culture. But what were some of the biggest cultural differences that you saw, and how did you go about managing that across the board from America, China, and the UK?
A couple of little cameos in a way, because I remember one of my first retailer meetings in the US with a very well-established owner of a retail group that had a number of different brands there, and we'll get on extremely well. And we're about an hour and a quarter into the conversation, and he said, "Oh, by the way, I just thought I'd better tell you, we're suing you." I said, "Sorry?" He said that we're suing you because of supply from 2010, 2011. We didn't get the allocation we should have got, so we're suing you. And of course, as a Brit in that environment, my first reaction to him was, "Listen, if you sue me, I'll never speak to you again." And of course, because I'd come from that background, that was a confrontational activity. Of course, over there, it's not a confrontational activity. It's just a way of making progress on something where, frankly, he was right. He was right, no doubt about it. And we didn't go down a legal path eventually, but it was a real eye opener for me. The fact that, wow, this is a very different culture where that legal format is there at the fingertips and everybody knows it all the time. You have to be hellishly specific, where in Britain, I suppose, at times, a handshake does the deal, really. Maybe less so these days, but you're brought up in that manner that your word is your honour, and that's it. Of course, there's other cultures, and China's a very typical one whereby that is not the case. But when the document gets stamped, that's when you have an agreement, and not before that particular time. So yeah, I think you had to learn to listen and learn the fact that processes are different, and it's for you to align to the process, because they're not going to align to you. You are the visitor. You have to be respectful of what's going on there, not the other way around. And if you do that, then you'll get credibility, and people will probably come a little bit your way as well then. So I think, back to the adage of two ears, one mouth, it's very important when you operate in any market, including your domestic market. But certainly, when you operate in different cultures, you've got to align to what goes on over there. When in Rome is a classic expression, I think very valid, really.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. And I mean, I love, obviously, my husband's a big fan of you, but often tells me stories of how when he first came to the UK, just didn't understand why the Brits were asking, "How are you? How are you? And are you okay?" And he was like, why is everyone so concerned about my welfare? I don't understand. I was like, that is, it's just a classic Brit thing. How are you? Are you okay? And he says, but why do people say it with so much concern? Just didn't quite understand that. And my father, who actually worked for many, many years for a Chinese entrepreneur, said there was a day where he was in a business meeting with the owner of these multiple businesses. And I think it was an Australian came in and threw a business card across the table, and he went mad and wouldn't ever do business with him, just because of the simple fact that,
Yeah.
that the business card was not presented
Yes.
with two hands facing towards him. And it is, I mean, it's just amazing, isn't it? Some of the things that you describe there, and that you know, oh, by the way, you know, we're suing you. It's just, it's amazing, isn't it? Just these, you know, very, you know, how small things can be huge, have huge implications and huge impact.
And it's all about respect,
Mm.
really. You know, it's respect is very, very important. And those, you're right, the business card issue, especially in Asia, is really critical. Less so in the USA, but in Asia. And you must do it, because you are respecting not just the person, but the culture. And you know, if you do that, and they don't sound in many ways when you explain the most important things in the world, but they are. Because respect is fundamentally important, really. If you don't get that, you don't do business.
Did you have a particular favourite place that you've worked in so far, out of curiosity, Andy?
Wow. I must admit, I loved working in the States. I really, really enjoyed it. It was phenomenal because, you know, the Americans have got a real can-do attitude. And I saw them, you know, they worked with transparency. It was very open, and people wanted to win. And their marketing expertise was phenomenal, quite frankly. Their communication skills were phenomenal. But the openness with which they operated was great. And you know, I'd say again, there's nothing that was impossible. You know, you could pick the phone up to most people or get to most people and get things to happen, actually. And you could very quickly almost throw the spear in an organisation and say, guys, we're marching over there. And they wanted to march. You know, they want leadership, but they want to win. They really want to win. Not at all costs. It's not a negatively ruthless society in that respect. I don't think. I didn't see it like that. It was the fact that there was a joy in being successful. It wasn't frowned upon. As we know, in Britain often, you know, we build people up, then we tear them down. It's we love a bit of blame culture, which I think is massively counterproductive. I don't think you get that same blame culture in the USA, and therefore it's much more enjoyable. If I was honest as well, the time gap working in the States versus the UK also ended up being quite useful, because you knew on Friday, for example, from 11 o'clock onwards, there were going to be no phone calls. You could, you know, you could actually get on with stuff and realise that everybody else had cleared off and gone home, actually. The corollary was that from 4 o'clock in the morning, you could probably receive phone calls because people didn't realise where you were. It was 4, it wasn't 9. But I loved working in the States, and I would recommend it highly to anybody. It's not easy, of course, these days in terms of visas and so on and so forth. But if you do get the opportunity, it's really a great place to work, as many other countries are as well. And the States is not Canada. They're very different cultures. Both are very good as well. But I'd strongly recommend the USA.
And how did you find things coming back to the UK? Because I've heard many people and many execs that I've spoken with almost suffer more from culture shock coming back to their home place as opposed to going out. Clearly, it's been a huge...
It was a shock, and I think the biggest shock was customer service. You know, in this particular island in which we live, you know, people talk about it, but you don't often see really good customer service. In the USA, it's a norm. You know, people strive for it, and their businesses exist because of it. And if you don't deliver, then your business tends to go out of business very quickly. So coming back to the island, in that area was a shock, quite frankly. Principally also because I'd not worked for JLR in the UK before I went. I'd worked in a German culture for 12 years before I went to the States. So I then came back, you know, after 3 years in the States to, you know, a British culture and a non-German company as well. So yeah, that was it took some getting used to, quite frankly. Again, of course, there's lots of upsides. I think if we could deliver the type of customer service they do in North America and other parts of the world as well, the Far East is another good example, we'd certainly lift our game if we did that.
I absolutely concur with that. Absolutely concur. It is just exceptional. It's the best customer service I've ever had when I've been out in the States. And even, even in restaurants and things like this, or small eateries. And again, I've always wondered: is it the tipping culture? Is just the culture in general? It is. Absolutely, it's different level. But anyhow, moving on into the more recent career moves that you've made, Andy. We touched very briefly earlier on the move into the chairman role from being direct operational at board within other organisations. How have you found that? How have you found that transition? Because I think that's a very interesting kind of juxtaposition between those two, and often something that I hear from executives far more challenging than they ever perceived it could be, because they're less hands-on and often are so used to driving things and doing the do, if that makes sense.
Well, you're right. It's very different, especially you've come from being global sales director at board level, whereby you are driving 3,200 people to one extent or another to achieve monthly targets, and you are super operational in terms of the detail, the goals, the communication. To then move into a non-exec role whereby you're using your experience and your knowledge, but using it to guide. You're not doing anymore. You're creating a framework to a large extent, and I think you've got to be prepared for it. It's for people at the right time of their career, I think, but it's not for every personality either. For me, I think it was the right time, frankly. And as I say again, I'm very fortunate to work with a CEO who's an Oxford graduate who's extremely bright, but also understands the value of people's experience elsewhere. So very early in the role, we put together a 3-year strategy. I must admit that operationalising that within the COVID-19 environment, we'll have to probably reset the button on that one sooner or later. But then after you've got the strategy, doing performance management behind it, and actually helping the CEO to be the best CEO he can possibly be, is what your role is. And using your experience and, at board level to make sure that the important things are understood and move forward, and that the skill set of the other non-execs as well as the execs are brought to the fore. For me, it's got its own particular joy, which is very different than an executive role, but having you've got the badge, you've got the t-shirt, you don't have to prove yourself anymore in that regard. You've got credibility, and you must leave your ego at the door. I think that's really important. You have to leave your ego at the door. You are not the CEO. You are definitely not the CEO. If you want to be the CEO, do not become the chairman, really. Go and do another operational job till you've got it out of your system. And I think that it sounds like a small point, but the leaving the ego at the door thing is critically important. And I'm sure a lot of non-execs would say that to you, actually.
I love that expression. It's very much kind of nose in and fingers out, isn't it? When it comes to these kinds of positions. And on the ego side, I'm sure you've observed many over the years and tried to balance up many boardrooms. How important is it, would you say, to have an inclusive culture within that boardroom?
Oh God, it's critical. I mean, there's 7 of us sit around the board table at Vertu, and if I just go through the gender split, there's 4 males, 3 females. We've got fantastic lady Karen, who's the CFO of the organisation. Head of legal is there, and we've got a first-class non-exec who's operated at the most senior levels in HR with companies like Specsavers and Vodafone before. But I guess that the best thing I can say to you is that I don't even think about it now at that level. It's not, you don't have to be conscious of it because it's natural. I remember quite early in my career doing a test called the Belbin test, which is where it was done by, it's a scientific test actually, where it's about building teams and the fact that you don't want clones. You want people coming to the table with different skill sets. And it is absolutely true, frankly. And if you don't do that, and I've seen certain organisations that have not done that, thankfully less so these days than in the early part of my career, they just don't get it. There's things that they miss out on, frankly. And I've seen the situation developed over my long career. There's still a long way to go, especially in our industry. But thankfully, from a Vertu perspective, you know, I think we've got a very, very good balance. And I say it comes naturally. We've got some very talented people there, without a shadow of doubt. And it's quite a joy as a consequence of that, really.
That's so fantastic to hear. And again, not just because of the gender side, which, by the way, I think is absolutely exceptional. And I agree on the fact that, generally speaking, the automotive industry has got a huge way to go when it comes to diversity and inclusion and belonging. And, you know, of course, you know, gender is just one of those facets of D&I. I think often when people think diversity and inclusion, they instantly believe that you mean gender or perhaps BAME, you know, ethnicity, etc. But actually, there's so many different things that make up diversity and inclusion, be it social mobility, which we touched on very early on in the conversation, you know, gender, LGBTQ+, you know, what about all the invisible diversities, be it mental health, which many execs are suffering with at the moment, given the present circumstance, and lots of things that exist below the surface level, because ultimately, you know, what you're saying there, you know, is absolutely true. It's about having that diversity of mindset around the board, because if we have groupthink, it's a very dangerous thing to have a lot of yes people, yes men or women around the table, having people who will proactively challenge in, you know, in a good way, and having that diversity of thought is ultimately what there breeds the innovation and leads to an inclusive board. And you know, of course, gender just one part of that, but again, very, very pleasing to hear, because as one facet of D&I, I think historically there has not been so many females at board level at all, or perhaps you know, other strands of diversity perhaps. So it's great that you're at the helm, or I should say nose in and fingers out in the chair position with Vertu.
I think it's a critical part of governance, and governance is really important anyway, because, you know, I've seen a couple of examples, I won't go through them, to protect the non-innocent, if you like, where poor governance virtually ruined companies. And the corollary is also true. You know, if you can get strong, wide, good governance, then you add value, and you're there to add value. Whatever you do, you are there to add value. And you know, the more people become conscious and educated, the better things should be, actually. And you know, it's woeful when you see it not happening, frankly, because those organisations, they're almost like, you know, time bombs ticking, actually, because they just don't get it.
Absolutely. And before we run out of time today, Andy, just a little bit of fun just at the end. And if you've listened to the podcast before, you'll know what's coming, which is the lightning round. And I'm going to give you 30 seconds only to answer each of the following questions before we summarise. Firstly, well, it's quite a big question, I'm afraid, but what has been or is your secret to success?
Strong family background, you know, with there's no doubt who the boss is domestically, and it's certainly not me, with good judgment, and actually surround yourself with brilliant people. You know, pull on the leads now and again, but surround yourself with brilliant people and let them get on with it. Do not micromanage them.
Who's been your biggest inspiration?
I think early in my career, there's a gentleman who's still alive today. He's 84 years old, called Trevor Taylor, who was a phenomenal character in the early part of my career. And then anybody who knows the car industry will have heard the name Hans Riedel, who was the CMO at Porsche, and a phenomenal marketeer, and certainly taught me a hell of a lot about brand, which has lived with me ever since, really.
Wonderful. And finally, in fact, sorry, second to last question, what does diversity and inclusion mean to you personally?
It means the fact that you are recognising the fact that we live in a global world with lots of different characteristics and lots of different motivations and lots of different cultures. And the people that buy your products come from that global world. So if you do not create that bloodline of alignment there, quite frankly, you are not doing them, the customers, justice, nor your own organisation or your own people. It's just a no-brainer, frankly.
Absolutely. It's a business imperative. I completely agree. And it's doing the right thing, as you say. And finally, I promise, last question is if you were to be able to go back in time and give your younger self, young Andy, advice at the age of, say, 22, at that kind of pivotal moment, if you will, in your life, what would you say?
Whatever you do, go and live and work outside the country you're born in. And do it more than once. Go and see the world and go and work there and absorb what's going on, because your education will become much more rounded. I think it's absolutely critical. Do not fall into the trap of, I can't do it because I've got 2.4 children and a wife and a house in Surrey. That does not work, frankly. And if people don't do that, they hit the glass ceiling of their capability very quickly. And they'll miss out, quite frankly.
Thank you so much, Andy. It's been absolutely fascinating and insightful learning from you today, and having our listeners hear about not only the career and some of the personal things that you shared, which I thought were really, really wonderful, but also there's so many key learning points in there that I think many will be able to take away, especially those that are considering or in the move to either another country or moving from CEO into chair. So thank you very, very much indeed.
My pleasure, very much so. Thank you.
By way of a summary, I'll keep it very brief, but I think certainly for me, some of the key learning points were absolutely the importance of internationalism, the importance of having two ears and one mouth, making sure that you're listening like a sponge to what's going on within your environment, to really stepping up to the plate and actually being brave enough to go outside of your country of origin, because as Andy said, there's so many opportunities there and things that you can bring back to your home country perhaps one day. Really giving that well-rounded experience. Clearly, Andy himself, very, very driven individual, but I think sometimes having those difficult times in our lives, there is silver linings to those clouds. Least of all at the moment, obviously, we're all facing this invisible enemy, but really trying to look where you possibly can at where there are positive opportunities and where you can learn and develop yourself more. And finally, what I absolutely love from what you'd said, Andy, there was about leaving ego at the door. I think that is something that absolutely everyone can learn from. Leaving your ego at the door, whether you are in the boardroom situation, whether you are, in a slightly different situation. Ego is no good to anyone. There's a brilliant book actually written about ego being the enemy. And so, actually bringing humanity to this and really listening. It's, I'm sure, impossible to listen too much, because actually all of that great knowledge can be utilized and, used to help support multicultural environments, as Andy has said, and I think listening leaders more so these days than ever before, given current environment and over communicating with people is very, very, very important indeed. So I hope you all enjoyed this week's podcast as much as I did. We're going to put all the show notes onto the end of today's show for you, so if you missed anything, any key pieces of information there or learnings, don't worry at all. We'll put all the bullet points there for you. My name is Leila Mackenzie-Dallas, and you've been listening to the Diverse and Inclusive Leaders podcast. We're with you every week, but we're here a little more frequently at the moment because of the unprecedented times. You can visit us at www.dalglobal.org/podcast. Look forward to seeing you again very soon. Thank you so much for watching the Diverse and Inclusive Leaders podcast. Please do feel free to hit the like button below, or if you'd like to receive future notifications, do ping the notification bell here at the side. If you're interested in the audio version only, you can find it on the following streaming platforms. Any extra info and descriptions will be in the links below. Look forward to seeing you soon.